The young man's name was Ward. Several hours have passed, and everyone on the train has gotten off. Ward curiously opened the bag, but was startled by the shimmering golden light inside. Taiwanese novel websites offer a great way to relieve boredom. E-wooking. The NUM are super useful. On a raised rocky hill, the city's tallest building, a majestic castle stands. The terrain is relatively flat, but higher in the northwest, sloping slightly towards the southeast. Ash bricks are not bricks made from ash. After answering the questions, the three people in the carriage entered the city of Ouroboros. In any case, Loren felt that he was sneezing much more often lately. Loren was finally ready to officially begin his day. Construction of the city of Ouroboros began with this fortress as its starting point. In other words, this is the heart of the city. Dressed and ready, Loren was currently on the third floor of the fortress, the highest floor. The girl was about 20 years old and wore a dark blue robe-style high-necked wool coat. One of the keys was indeed the key to this private office. Loren took the documents with a headache, glanced through them, and finally sighed helplessly. Barfos asking questions. Loren also sensed that the other person was acting strangely, but he dismissed the feeling as a mere illusion. Loren then tossed aside his doubts and the documents that had just been handed to him. When Loren went inside, a young girl was already sitting on the sofa. The girl was also probably only 20 years old. After stretching, Loren sat down on the sofa and couldn't help but speak as he looked at Elena's curious eyes. Returning to a serious topic, the two of them changed from playful to serious expressions. Loren took the contract and began to carefully read the text. The price is quite reasonable, making it a very worthwhile deal for both Loren and the city of Ouroboros. After smiling, Elena turned back and closed the door again. Once again, only Loren remained in the room, wearing a strange expression. Elena, who had just come out of the room, quickly tidied her hair and looked around helplessly. Arashia, who was holding documents, peeked out and glanced around furtively. After leaving the guest room, Loren returned to his office, ready to seriously deal with today's administrative affairs. In addition, several mines have been discovered on the west side of the city. Sending miners to excavate the precious ores inside is a matter that requires remote command. In short, there is a mountain of things to do, and no amount of time can possibly be enough. After finishing dinner, Loren reached into his pocket and realized he had somehow left his keys in the office. The tall woman with black hair and a ponytail, dressed in a close-fitting maid outfit, simply nodded slightly. Taiwanese novel websites are amazing. TTL has a huge library. As a normal residence for a city lord, it is an absolutely qualified fortress. Loren stepped out and entered the stairwell. Damp smell fills the air, and even the lighting equipment has been changed from lamps to torches. The basement level is a relatively hidden warehouse in the city. In addition to storing grain, its most essential function is to store some precious strategic resources or very rare treasures. The crimson flames of the enormous forge were still burning. A green magic circle is engraved on it. Loren closed his eyes and placed his left hand on it. The so-called teleportation is the technology that instantly transports something from one place to various parts of the world. The possibilities that teleportation magic can create are as countless as the stars in the sky. Unless one can master a containment system, similar to the one used in the train monster, to take a shortcut. Undoubtedly, this massive secret base was not a feat that Loren alone could accomplish in a year. The original plan was to use teleportation magic to quickly retreat after the exploration was completed. 2 years ago, when Loren first came here, he became very interested in this one-off base in the tower built inside the mountain. Sighed, then looked at the girl in front of him with a helpless expression. Pushing open the door in front of them, the group entered the interior of this mountain tower. Upon hearing this, Eleanor frowned slightly, then strode over to Loren's side. Eleanor reached out as if it were a habit, grabbed Loren, and then turned and walked away. The two walked forward, and surprisingly, the huge rock seemed to exist as if it didn't exist at all. Latine was still completely bewildered when Eleanor produced a small pendulum from somewhere. Eleanor took out a small bottle of flour from somewhere and placed it on the balcony. The light emanating from these enormous diamonds transformed into tangible optical fibers which interconnected and ultimately formed a colossal graphic. To Loren's astonishment, what appeared in the starry sky was a birthday cake with lit candles. Elena and Loren sat in chairs, staring blankly at the scene that had been set up hours earlier. Loren had been in this world for 2 years. After hearing Eleanor's words, Loren's slightly confused look gradually returned to normal. Upon hearing this, Eleanor chuckled softly, took Loren's right hand, in her other left hand, and said gently, "Loren," nodded, then stepped in front of the silver-haired girl and walked forward. Before seeing this scene, Loren finally realized what had happened. Even though the windows in the room were tightly closed, Loren soon discovered that the truth behind this long cold wind was indeed from someone as sharp as a knife elf. Her face didn't even look at Loren. Her mere gaze, directed straight ahead, sent a chill down his spine. 3 names that are known to everyone in the world. After hearing Nettinger's explanation, Loren nodded in understanding, and then asked another question. After hearing this, Loren did not press the matter further, but instead changed the subject. Loren didn't particularly dislike the Cult of the Stars, so he continued to listen. As Nettinger calmly finished reading the sentence, the room instantly fell silent. Despite the weather outside, Loren felt as if he were being warmed by a small sun. The maids brought from the Vasilofis family were busily working under the head maid's command. The moment Loren opened the door, a bolt of lightning struck down from the sky. The moment the door opened, Loren recognized the group of people. Lotte threw the bag she was carrying on the table, then ran over and ruffled Loren's hair. On this day last year, Loren was lying in bed, dizzy from the battle in the city of Obristo. After those words were spoken, the surrounding conversations, no, even the soft sound of rain, all vanished. Despite having set out at 7 o'clock, they found themselves late when they finally climbed the small rocky hill. Back then, this city was just a chaotic little village, barely even a manor. The village walls were dilapidated. Eleanor could understand why the other man was so busy. Lotte smiled and peeked out. The Adventurers Guild is an organization established by the Maxix Empire and the Technoroya Federation to manage adventurers. The other party made a promise to themselves. The wooden door was pushed open, and the blonde boy took a deep breath before stepping into the room. Poured into the room. In what should have been Loren's main workstation, sat a middle-aged man who bore an uncanny resemblance to him. The man was simply reading a book. Loren didn't dare look directly at his father, so he lowered his gaze to the gift. Only Loren and Clifton remained in the room. Loren swiftly pulled out the chair that was originally meant for entertaining guests. Loren nodded. He naturally remembered the major event that had occurred 2 years ago. Not to mention that the king was a lord who ruled a mountain range. For Loren, this day was undoubtedly the happiest he had been in recent days. During these 2 years, Loren has experienced many ups and downs and has amassed considerable power. Loren's ultimate goal is to make every day in the future just like today. Upon hearing Lena's words, Loren's body trembled instinctively, and his expression quickly turned secresis. Upon hearing this, Loren tilted his head in confusion, but Lena ignored him and continued speaking. After wiping away his sweat, Loren looked up at the Adventurers Guild's membership certificate and the several exquisite wooden boxes. Loren's mind raced, and he began to ponder. The Adventurers Guild's entry certificate is an exquisite parchment certificate. The first thing Loren took out was a black book. The book was as thick as 3 or 4 bricks stacked together. In the Martial Maxix Empire, all lords and nobles have the right to form their own private armies. Naturally, the resources required to cultivate a powerful army are immense. The methods for transforming people into superhumans are self-evident. Loren opened the Mirror Moon Legacy and quickly found a black card inside. The reason why different armies have different characteristics and combat methods is that the family's legacy is the core. Loren took out something that looked like a green briefcase from a military camp. Confused, Loren turned on the button on the briefcase, and a huge blast of cold air hit him. The suitcase, kept in sub-zero conditions, contained 30 white crystals and 30 bottles of green potion. As for nourishing potions, they are extremely precious potions that can strengthen the body and even extend lifespan. Without a doubt, it is an absolute gem. 6 huge chapters, plus over 100 mini-chaps, made Loren feel a little dizzy. Regardless of the subject matter, a gradual approach is essential. As a collection of knowledge, books themselves are carefully calculated and arranged by those who understand the subject matter. The Frontier Era is the first era of this world, symbolizing the origin of mankind. Loren suddenly realized that although this was the history of another world, still others were more fanatical. Most people died as a result, while a minority gained power. Finally, Loren specifically looked at an example of how several lords gained power and ruled the world. Loren had originally planned to find some clues about the Black Dragon King. For Loren, who was used to Chinese breakfasts. Such a lavish meal made him worry about gaining weight. After hearing his father's explanation, Loren nodded in understanding. As someone who built a city on this canal and specifically planned this area, Loren now has the confidence to redeem himself. Curious, Loren reached inside, intending to pull out what was inside. As Loren focused intently on cracking the combination lock, the other diners in the restaurant finished their meals and left. After breakfast, Loren arrived at the port of Obristo very early today. Taiwanese novel websites run incredibly smoothly. TTF is super hassle-free. Whenever he saw Elena spending money. Upon hearing the voice, Loren quickly turned around with a smile and looked at the two familiar figures. Upon seeing the two familiar figures, Loren turned around with a smile. Loren raised his head and looked towards the harbor, until a sudden sound interpreted his confusion. Among them, Niedinger was undoubtedly the best. Loren understood what the other person meant, so he nodded. The city of Ouroboros, surrounded by walls, has 4 gates in total, located in the east, west, south, and north. The eastern gate is the most special of them all, as it stands on the lifeblood of Ouroboros, the Great Canal. The familiar 2-masted sailing ship slowly entered the canal and headed towards the port. Klaus smiled as well, then looked up at Loren with the same expression. Once the functions of each area are defined, the general shape of the city of Ouroboros is established. The former residents have all moved to other areas Loren was quite surprised that Nightingale had taken a liking to this place. Loren didn't want to interfere, so he simply nodded. After hearing Crow's answer, Loren nodded, and then asked another question. Unfortunately, the way it was sticking out its tongue and wantonly licking Loren's right hand revealed its silly nature. In other words, Tindaros's black wolf fur and its current transformed state are one of the symbols of its evolution. Loren was quite curious about all the power Tintalos now possessed. Lyriel looked up at the familiar stone castle before her as if she were about to cry. 2 of the girls are struggling to recover, while the other 2 are completely unable to make a sound. Leaning against the huge wooden box and not posing in an unsightly way is already their limit. The box, which 4 superhumans had struggled to drag, was effortlessly lifted by Loren alone. After resting for a while, and with the help of the wind, the 4 of them quickly returned to normal. As creaking sounds rang out, 4 girls slowly peeked out and cast their gazes inside. The chairs in the main hall, which were originally intended to entertain important figures, were now completely removed. The girl with long sky blue hair and the young man with blonde hair were sitting in the 2 chairs respectively. The pieces were intertwined, and the 2 players deployed their troops, like generals commanding a large army. Every move of each piece contained the commander's scheme, and a fierce war, without gunpowder, broke out on the chessboard. Lotel, who was sitting next to him, stuffed a snack into her mouth and answered, just like when Loren was playing a horror game in his previous life. Loren's intuition told him that if he wanted to survive, he absolutely could not confront that rage. The source of that golden light is gold. The basement level serves as the fortress's warehouse. So naturally, there are plenty of boxes for storing things. Loren nodded, picked it up, and then began to move the huge wooden crate outside. As Loren calculated the resources and knowledge he had acquired over the past year, as Loren stuffed the crystals into the other boxes, he was surprised by his haul. Magic crystals are crystals containing a trace of magical energy. While pondering the relevant knowledge, Loren began to categorize and store the crystals. Upon hearing Loren's voice, the woman with the high ponytail, who looked a little tired, raised her head. When Loren returned, the chess tournament continued. Everyone else remained seated. Even Claude and Lily had already taken their places. Black and white have spread their forces out, and the preparation for their formations is complete. The king is in the safest position. Needless to say, this cool scene was naturally a design that Loren himself conceived in his mind. Loren could only imagine what was happening in his mind. Lorenton was even more shocked, because he really didn't expect Eleanor to be so good at chess. Cliffin Vasilevs was a man of many talents. Loren had only asked the question casually, but he hadn't received an answer, even after a full 5 seconds. Sensing something was wrong, Loren turned around and looked at his sister. Arashia, Elaine, and Lotel were embracing, their bond somehow making them look like true sisters. Vesta was packing things up with Taylor next to Clifton. Clifton glanced at Loren with his golden eyes behind his monocle, then looked up and left. The person had even covered their face with a book. Everyone has their own troubles. When talking about the Mage Tower, Loren was reminded of the birthday gifts he had received earlier. Loren's older sister gave him a batch of soul crystals as a gift. These were genuine materials containing powerful souls. In most of the time, in Loren's memory, they were all people with different personalities, but quite fun. The four of them sighed in unison, and then began to organize their weapons again. Arashia hurriedly started working, after saying goodbye to Lotel, while Elena remained sitting on the sofa. As for Eleanoa, she remained seated, carefully observing the game of chess. When the opportunity arises in the future, these powerful magical beasts are destined to return to this city. The beautiful blue skin was stained red with blood, and the roar changed from venting anger to expressing terror. Upon discovering they had been spotted by the enemy. In the beginning, this land was a barren wasteland where cultivation was extremely difficult. Normally, ordinary people who haven't become superhumans are no match for magical beasts. In reality, using those precious magical beasts to inscribe mere arrows was a pure loss-making business. The castle gates were quickly opened by a maid. Claude was sitting at the table, curiously watching the scene before him. Along with Lily and Elfrena, Violetta was holding two chessboard-like objects in her arms. Violetta took out a small box at the right moment. On the huge chessboard, a miniature world filled with cities, forests, mountains, and snowfields was displayed. After seeing the chessboard take shape, Lily nodded in satisfaction, then turned to Crow and greeted him. The workshop in front of them was still messy and dirty. Ultimately, this kind of workshop is just the most basic base for mages. During the long year of study, Loren learned many new things and mastered many new abilities. Loren then continued rummaging through his backpack, arranging everything on the alchemy table. Red, blue, purple, and green herbs, dozens of similar yet distinct herbs were laid out on the table. The sheer variety meant that this was not something a novice herbalist could comprehend. After completely destroying them, the mixture was combined and fermented. After all these steps were completed, the final result was a bottle of green potion that Loren collected. The soil that came into contact with the liquid began to sprout. The table was decorated with various stars, pentagrams. Each parchment was engraved with a star pattern. Star symbol, like alchemy, is a name that has been passed down since the pioneering era. Drops of ink fell onto the parchment, and the brush slowly smeared to the across it. Loren raised his head and looked at the small room, carved out of the mountain rock in the air. Without using magic, Loren placed his hands on his left, forming a megaphone to project his words. A minute later, like a god descending from the sky, the silver-haired girl gracefully appeared before Loren. Loren nodded, indicating his approval of Eleanoa's proposal. The city of Ouroboros should have a considerable amount of clay deposits. The vast majority of the bricks needed by this emerging city are not purchased from elsewhere. Loren was holding a book. Several hours later, amidst the blazing fire, the humanoid puppet, standing at least 2 meters tall, finally took shape. The star was connected to the earth element, and the star symbol was pasted in the center. With the most crucial first step completed, the next step is the second one. Loren opened the small birchwood box on the ground. Elena had personally witnessed powerful puppet life forms. With this golem, Loren now has the best helper he can get. The blonde woman, wearing a loose nightgown, greeted Loren while rubbing her eyes, which were not yet fully open. After sighing, Loren tidied his hair with a comb, then turned and left. Lena, who had transformed from a languid and beautiful mature noblewoman into a handsome and dashing adventurer, nodded in satisfaction. The sand was scorching hot. After closing the box, Loren carefully checked it. Then satisfied, he carried the fertilizer away from the small workshop. The city lord had spent a great deal of time establishing it. For this simple reason, Lena turned and walked toward the towering castle. The Star God cult was established much slower than the Silver Stream Merchant Guild. Arashia was happy to do these things, especially when all her actions were of her own volition. Being able to take control of one's own life is something to celebrate for Arashia. Once they saw the cosmetics in the box, everything would be revealed. 4 enormous holes were fitted into the belt. The tentacle's body was composed of 3 silver triangular metal pieces, resembling the hands of a marine creature. Loren had given up resisting and moved with the tentacles. Arashia watched awkwardly as Loren drifted in the wind until the mechanical tentacles finally stopped moving. In just a few days, the giant clay golem has completed a lot of construction work. Loren was standing before a crafting table, carefully carving a gem. A box sat on the table, and strangely, fragmented text kept emanating from inside. Loren made 2 extra earplugs and put them in his ears to block out Jinor's voice as much as possible. After the battle at the Chrysos Merchant Guild, contrary to Loren's expectations, he unexpectedly completed 2 missions in one go. Loren couldn't understand why his systems was so useless. Loren nodded, then moved the system task away and opened the panel function. The contained entity, Jino, had already shut its mouth. Loren casually glanced at the cover and was briefly shocked by the information on it. Loren saw a familiar name. After returning to the workshop from the Mage Tower, Loren sneaked into the basement and finally opened the door. She only opened her eyes after hearing Loren's voice. Long white stockings and high boots completed the look. Loren paused for a moment, then remembered what he had said earlier, and his eyes lit up with excitement. The boy was completely enveloped by an overwhelming sense of pain. Loren felt as if his cheeks were damp with liquid. Loren opened his eyes in confusion. Finally, as his vision became clearer and his mind became more active, Loren finally understood his current situation. Loren collapsed onto the floor in an extremely ugly duckling position. Lena was laughing happily for some reason. Loren didn't know what to say, or rather, he was completely unable to utter a single word. The train continued moving forward. After all, it was just a small matter within the vast territory occupied by the Maxix Empire. The girl nodded in satisfaction and then habitually patted Loren's head before speaking. Loren had 5 hours of free time to do with before 7 p.m. The waiter bowed respectfully to Loren and then turned to leave. Loren took a deep breath and then placed his hand on the doorknob. A dozen or so people stared blankly at Loren, whose face was covered in black lines and spilled alcohol. Upon hearing this, Loren paused for a moment, then looked at the boy beside him with a surprised expression. Having finally broken free from his sister, Wall breathed a sigh of relief and then turned to look at Loren. Loren poked his head out and looked over in confusion. The text, stitched together with red and silver threads, revealed the name of the organization that had extended the invitation. At least in Loren's memory, his predecessor had never been there. Loren was quite surprised when he saw this study tour funded by the Empire. Slarn shook his head and only picked up his things after the carriage had left. Loren's own maid wore the standard. Every bit of the atmosphere there was filled with the unique oppressive power and majesty of royalty. Anna took Loren to the royal living area, which was also a private area belonging only to Lena. Next, Anna opened up and started talking about all sorts of royal private matters. Gossip is something people like to hear even if it offends others. Anna, who hadn't chatted with a trustworthy stranger in a long time, was having a great time. After giving Loren an apologetic look, she made her escape. Loren was still wearing his most comfortable casual clothes. The dress was made of some unknown material and emitted a beautiful starlight. Lena placed her hands in the copper basin, and Loren, while mimicking her movements, frowned in confusion. The lifespan of extraordinary beings is even longer than that of ordinary people. The Golden Age was the most prosperous era on this continent. Lena were 5 years apart. They were essentially the same age. Loren zessed that it was some kind of unique etiquette, but he did not think about it at the moment. The first course was a giant boiled egg, resembling an ostrich egg, served in a stemmed glass. Its orange-red exterior was cut open, revealing a molten yolk, sprinkled with fluorescent seaweed. The main course was a rib. After receiving the same serrated knife and small spoon from Anna, Lena began to explain in detail. Loren lowered his head slightly and bowed respectfully to the other party. Loren had eaten dishes made from magical beasts before. After his transmigration, the 3 people were in a small room. The room was made of stone bricks. Obsidian is an extremely sturdy stone. The room they were in appeared to be surrounded by a city. The flags flying nearby indicated that they were still within the territory of the Maxix Empire. In other words, they should be outside a city at this moment. But the question was, which city? Lena was familiar with the place. She sat down on the sofa in the room, pulled Anna over, and began to explain to Loren. A pure black tower built of obsidian would normally give a very exaggerated sense of oppression to first visitors. The room was also tightly blocked by a door made of obsidian. Loren's thirst for knowledge drove him to enter these small rooms to see what secrets they held. After wisely extinguishing his sudden burst of exploration, Loren continued to follow the clay golem forward. After the clay golem pushed open the door, Loren saw a familiar figure. To say they were familiar wouldn't be quite right. Just like the relationship between Loren Vista and Clifton, she was practically a giant version of Reyna. While the two were chatting, Loren was carefully observing the room with a curious gaze. Furthermore, the guards in this room were far superior to those in other areas. The two enormous golems, standing beside the woman on the recliner, weren't made of clay, but were hard rock golems. Lena smiled gently, stood up from the recliner, and led the mature woman to Loren before introducing them. Lady nodded seemingly casually. Then her lifeless eyes slowly swept over the nervous Loren beside her before returning to Rhina. Loren felt a cold sweat break out all over his body. The room fell completely silent for at least a minute. The situation only changed when the sound of something falling was heard. After Lady comfortably lay down, it pressed a button and the recliner began to enter its super transformation mode. Loren shook his head, dismissing the unrealistic thought, and continued walking forward with Lady. The giant stone golems made a much louder sound when they moved than the clay golems. After careful observation, Loren realized that his preconceived notions had caused the problem. Through large slabs of transparent glass, one could see that the furnaces were filled with a liquid resembling boiling water. A slightly embarrassed Loren took the notebook, while Lady yawned and continued to explain. The Maxix Empire did not have any rules regarding the primogeniture of males. The soldiers of the Maxix Empire were routed in their first encounter with the Beast Legion. She placed the flower of rebirth into the flower pot and continued to explain the mysterious tower to Loren, whether it was simply out of consideration for Lena. Loren had never received systematic magical training, not to mention Eleanoa, a witch who was hunted by the world. The tower's owner unconditionally showed Loren what a mage's tower should contain. Lady casually peeked out and looked at Loren writing intently, then exclaimed in surprise. The corridor was covered in dust, a testament to the long, long absence of life. The only source of light was the blue magic circle on the obsidian door. Countless mysterious lines are etched onto the crystal ball. Rena was now comfortably leaning back on it, thoroughly enjoying the stone golem's participativeness. Anna stared wide-eyed at the flying crystal ball. The three girls were playing lazily. As Loren pondered carefully, Lady continued to add her own insights. After hearing the other party's somewhat vague description, Loren curiously reached out and asked a question. Compared to the enormous cake Loren had eaten a week and a half ago, the mature woman before them was no ascetic, living in seclusion in the mountains. The numerous items scattered throughout the bedroom are countless blueprints filled with black marks. When Loren saw the design drawings, he involuntarily began to exhale white breath through his nose. After giving a cold laugh, Lady continued. Lady nodded in satisfaction, and Loren nodded in agreement before continuing to ask. Letting out a confused sigh, Lady gave a wry smile in response. Loren had originally planned to head home after visiting the Mage Tower today. The two familiar stone golems carried a lump of cups over. Loren lit an oil lamp and began to think about what he had learned. At some point, Loren found himself holding the massive general outline in his hands again. As Loren pondered the words, he opened the book in his hand. Yet, in order to explore these knowledge and powers that are beyond human comprehension, the rules that ordinary humans had accumulated over decades were like a tall building built brick by brick. At that time, this continent was just like the warring states period of the previous life. Some were kind, some were evil, some were lazy, and some were arrogant. Some swelled with ambition, raised armies, and waged war against other nations. In a certain period of the pioneering era, 13 heinous criminals were imprisoned in a certain country. By sheer coincidence, a containment entity appeared in this prison, and luckily chose these 13 criminals who met its criteria. 12 cities, surrounding 13 towns of them, formed the most famous kingdom of the warring states period, the Nightmare Playground. Even as kings, they might only have exploited their people in the simplest ways. Using immense power, these 13 cities were transformed into 13 game cities, each with its own unique style. All resources and land for survival were taken over by the king. Loren raised his head and nodded solemnly. Loren knocked on the door of the guest room next door, and after finding it unlocked, he pushed it open. The wrinkles on the two beds had been smoothed out, and even personal belongings were gone. Rubbing his head, Loren turned around and walked towards the room of the tower's owner. The empire's eldest princess was leaning against a window, looking at the sunlight. The stamp was covered in dust and looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. After carefully studying the history of this world, Loren also learned what constitutes a precious work of art. Loren took the letter, looking at the stamp with a drooling expression, and casually asked a question. After hearing Loren's long string of questions, Lady suddenly gave an awkward laugh and slowly explained. Loren suddenly felt as if he had received a very abstract task from a very abstract person. By the time Loren understood how Lady, a wealthy sorceress, would send people away, he had no time to refuse. In the next room, only the boy's mournful screams, which began to echo, remained. Arashia and Elena were snuggled together, reading a book. All Loren could offer in response was an awkward smile. Loren smiled apologetically, then took the thick woolen robe from her, and quickly covered himself with it. Belle looked at Loren with relief. Many of the residents and guards of Ouroboros have been feeling this way lately. Loren recalled that all sorts of magical beasts had crossed the war-torn land and arrived in the Black Forest. After calculating, it still earned Loren a small sum of money. Knowing that this is human-controlled territory, why would these magical beasts approach their own kingdom? The Belixmi Mountains, along with various monster empires, were chosen by powerful monsters because countless monsters were buried there. Loren certainly wanted to continue thinking about it. Before hearing the specific data, Loren raised his hand to stop Arashia from continuing, and solemnly announced. Having understood Loren's meaning, Arashia blinked nervously as if to confirm, and asked again. Loren raised his head, rubbed his temples with his fingers, and made this decision very seriously. Loren gave a wry smile, lowered his head, and looked at the pile of metal strips in front of him. The price of gold in this world is different from the price of gold in Loren's previous life. Loren was not an economist, so he has no interest in and is too lazy to study these things. While pondering carefully, Loren looked at the slip of paper in his hand, stamped with a unique seal. Both times, it was used to exchange for resources of equal value from the other party. The enormous monster looming before Loren was actually a wild boar. Moreover, this was no ordinary wild boar, but a genuine magical beast with powerful monster blood. Its sharp tusks were enough to pierce through armor. Loren remained calm and composed, staring directly at the colossal object before him. After the dust settled, the huge wild boar had closed its eyes and collapsed limply to the ground. Loren sighed, then reached out and pressed his hand onto the battered animal hide. Even though it was on its last legs and could die at any moment, the bodies of magical beasts are already valuable, supernatural materials and food. Just their fangs alone could be made into two incredibly sharp longswords, if dismantled. Especially considering that this magical beast is female, its value is even higher. Loren had wanted to raise magical beasts for a long time. Just like growing magical potions, just matching pairs of animals was enough to give Loren a headache, let alone building a breeding farm later on. By this time the wild boar's wounds had been almost healed. Loren took out a small bottle of clear sleeping potion from his pocket. Loren took a deep breath and felt the air coursing through his body, making him feel incredibly refreshed. Loren's ears were being brutally tortured by inhuman forces. After removing the enormous belt from his body, Loren began to hang it back on the shelf next to him. As Loren pondered, he used the knowledge in his mind to imbue the object with magic. Loren quickly completed the second simple enchantment in a short time. Today is August 13th, still at the tail end of summer. Some families have even started buying coal to fill their stone fireplaces with fuel. Wearing a hooded cloak, Loren walked down the street with Claude. The city's guards turned a lever. The massive vessel, moored before the gate, slowly crossed the city wall and rumbled into Ouroboros. The massive storm caused by the cold wave became a powerful power source. The huge ship had already docked at the port. Several burly men were standing on the eaves. Despite the cold wind blowing, they were only wearing thin clothes, as if it were summer. The cold wind did not make their well-trained bodies waver in the slightest. Loren turned his head and looked at Crow. After casting a spell on himself, Loren felt his body warm up. Crow next to him also felt as if he were holding a hand warmer. Upon hearing Geralt's praise, Loren gave a wry smile and then took a sip of tea. The tea had a bitter taste, which Loren disliked. Ouroboros is not a very large city after all. It was only built by Loren in less than a year. Loren named this place the Beginning Land, and thus began his life story in this new world. Upon hearing this, Geralt's expression turned serious. Loren instinctively looked around to make sure that besides the two people chatting, Loren nodded seriously, then answered earnestly. Creatures from the Dark Ages were unlikely to survive into the Golden Ages. Loren was almost certain that there could not be a true Black Dragon King. Loren nodded, indicating that he already knew all of this information. Whenever dragons are mentioned, Loren thinks of the black dragon he saw on his way to Sapota. The teacups were half empty. The old man and the young man raised their cups and drank again. Upon hearing this, Belle, who was making tea nearby, frowned in confusion. Before this, they had been driven to the brink of despair by the Black Dragon for a short period. Loren planned to personally defeat the dragon to test his strength. The Black Hoptissus, Wadatta medicinal herb that Loren discovered 2 years ago when he explored the Immortal King's fortress. A careful examination of many advanced alchemical recipes reveals its presence within them. For most alchemists, Black Lotus is undoubtedly a highly prized ingredient. Many potent potions are made from Black Lotus. As Loren was fiddling with things, Satlan rubbed his head, and for some reason, he remembered the 12 alpha containment entities that Jignal had mentioned. After a moment of silence, Loren stopped what he was doing, looked up at Eleanor, and said seriously. Upon hearing Nettinger's practiced answer, Loren raised an eyebrow in surprise, as if he hadn't expected it at all. The fluffy little dog looked at the candy, with its big eyes. After saying that, Nettinger stood up and went back to the birdcage to play with the rather cute birds. As long as they have a suitable weapon, they can naturally unleash their power. Loren was already used to the other party's malicious. Elena giggled and ran in front of Loren, then began to seriously introduce them to him. Elena peeked out and couldn't help but look enviously at the Storm, which was always docked beside the harbor. At this time last year, Miss Elena was the daughter of the president of the world's largest chamber of commerce. The ship was slightly smaller than the Storm. Loren was puzzled by the enthusiasm shown by Nettinger and Elena, then shook his head. Loren then opened his eyes again and couldn't help but express his feelings. About a year has passed. The old man before them was the apparent leader of this sapota. Elena looked around at the geology. Upon hearing this, the white-haired elder nodded solemnly. Loren looked up and saw that it was a wooden house. After some time away, the island had developed considerably better than Loren remembered. The room was filled with bags of grain, all of very high quality. The elder stroked his beard and looked at Loren with a smile as he spoke. Loren nodded in satisfaction as well. Loren had no intention of cheating the other party. He simply profited from the circumstances and genuinely helped them. Loren quickly adjusted his chair, then looked up and spoke seriously. Loren tapped the golden scepter lightly and began his statement. Loren lowered his head and began to ponder seriously, recalling the roar of the dragon during their battle. 5 elderly men, all quite old, were currently on the 5 ships that Loren had brought. Loren then raised his head and looked at the silver-haired girl standing on the observation saucer Towson platform with her eyes closed. As Lorenz responded with a smile, then turned and looked at a ship beside him. Elena was leaning against the eaves. Despite his obvious concern for himself, Loren inexplicably smiled and turned back to the worried elder. Loren and Crow, who was in charge of piloting the ship, leaned out and looked intently at the blueprint. The parchment is covered with various drawings, and upon close inspection, one can vaguely discern that it is a map. A violent gale suddenly arose, and the calm seawater began to churn uncontrollably. The bottom of the ships was suddenly lifted up, as if by a giant hand. The blonde boy stood at the bow of the ship. The black monster opened its emerald green nose. The cold wave that blanketed the ash-covered pass was no threat compared to the storm before them. Dragons are children of nature. Their bloodline, containing the power to control the weather. The magical shield was shattered by the storm, whipped up by the dragon. The good news was that the shield was not disposable. The bad news was that each ship had a limited amount of magic power stored. The other ships were ready to retaliate. The dragon did not even move its mountain-like body, and the crossbow bolts fell into the ocean midway. A huge, purple light wave had been condensed at the muzzle, aimed at the dragon's head. For the first time, a look of confusion appeared in the dragon's fierce dark green pupils. The dark clouds dispersed, the gale reversed, and the the surrounding weather, was cleared away and calmed in an instant. Loren saw an enormous blue hammer. Loren's initial plan was to draw the battle to the sea or land. The clouds were swept away in an instant, and the seawater was vaporized in the blink of an eye. The surrounding air was unbearably hot, like hell. Loren quickly found a safe spot where he wouldn't be affected by the flames. Loren's first reaction was to worry about the fleet below. The figure that seemed like an ant, yet had just knocked itself here, appeared before it at some unknown time. The boots of light are magical artifacts that allow Loren to leap through shadows. Loren used this to touch the shadows on the clouds, and thus dodged the sky-covering fireballs. Under the protection of this shield, the weakened fire rain was successfully blocked completely. The ocean was evaporated by the fire rain, but the 5 ships remained safe and sound. Even though their bodies were unharmed, some of them suffered profound psychological problems. Its massive body alone is like a mountain, crushing opponents. In terms of ranged attacks, Loren had just been hit by that terrifying and varied fire breath. Loren began to fly in the air. The splashed liquid is actually a toxin, powerful enough to corrode any substance. Breath is a dragon's most powerful versatile spell that does not pursue any element other than attack, but is purely for the purpose of causing sich. Many of its hard scales had been shattered and were stuck in its already mangled body. Several holes appeared in its wings. Loren's massive body certainly gave him great strength and endurance. The black tail was like a fine paintbrush, and the blood on it was like fine hairs. The clouds and lightning, of course, served as dyes, and were drawn into actual individuals, forming an army. The humanoid life form, riding the dragon, raised its hands. Upon seeing this, Loren's memory suddenly and uncontrollably returned to the time when he first encountered this dragon. Loren sighed, then reached out his hand as if stroking something, and said with a touch of nostalgia. Loren gently turned his hand, and a pure gold box suddenly appeared on it. Loren tossed the golden box into the air, and a massive magic circle expanded from it. Golden characters, completely different from the languages Loren had learned in his 2 lives, were engraved on the circle. Despite the limited supply of magic, and the fact that there are only 10 of them, the elemental monsters are simply no match for them. Compared to these genuine Valkyries, they are no match at all. Having gained enough rest, the dragon opened its massive jaws once more, and unleashed a fierce breath. Hailong made a different rational choice than either of the two. Instant, the blue transformant flamed into sharp blades, like high-pressure water guns, destroying everything around them. Had the 5 ships not retreated slightly earlier to avoid being affected by the fire rain-like attack, amidst the sounds of explosions and flashes of light, everyone on the ship simultaneously showed expressions of surprise. Illuminated by that blue-white beam of light, large swathes of seawater transformed into crystals resembling transparent glass. Loren vaguely recognized it as the smell of ionized ozone. The surrounding environment was polluted by the radiation contained in the breath. Even their incredibly hard armor was sliced through like fragile wood, the cuts as smooth as glass. The attack was accompanied by a blinding flash that would blind anyone who looked directly at it. People in Loren's previous life had studied. In this world, people have also given this incredibly terrifying technique a name. The chaotic weather has now calmed down. The battlefield was in ruins. The Dragon Knights were all annihilated by the breath attack. Loren had originally intended to lure the enemy down below. The sub-zero temperatures began to suppress the scattered radiation pollution. She flew up with lightning speed and quickly stood in front of Loren. Everything in the sky, polluted by the nuclear fission breath, was scattered by the force of their impact, taking advantage of the moment when the two were entangled. Loren moved through the blizzard he had released at a speed faster than sound. Loren gripped his club tightly and smashed it down on the dragon's head. Otherwise, the ant would have already died into its mouth. The black dragon opened its mouth and mercilessly unleashed a deadly breath. The 3 hands on the clock were rotating counterclockwise, making it seem as if time had reversed. Simply put, it is 3 divination spells that can be performed instantly, without any preparation. As Loren pondered this, he turned and looked intently at Brunhilde beside him. After realizing that the other party had made the choice themselves, Loren finally nodded in understanding. The left half of the enormous dragon head, the right half, was much better. Even so, the black dragon before them, whose entire body was covered in wounds, was still alive. Loren wanted to chase after him. The only strange thing was that it was the princess who was carrying the exhausted prince. Loren tilted his head back, looked at the sky, sighed helplessly, and then chuckled softly. For the residents of Sapta, today is a pretty good day. Lily, carrying a small backpack, stood excitedly in front of Loren and saluted. A young man clad in animal skins, who had been waiting outside, slowly entered carrying a huge platter. The roasted monster meat brushed with honey was not only fragrant but also tasted perfect. Loren had recently been researching the breeding of magical beasts, so this topic naturally attracted attention. The elder used a very large plate containing food. The surround area was peaceful and filled with bird song and fragrant flowers. The area was filled with the aura of death. Loren, standing at the very front, watched all of this with the most solemn expression. All of the above is controlled by a highly intelligent and powerful spirit. On his way to Sapota, Loren had already done a simple calculation of the forces he controlled. Lyriel, Elfrena, Violetta, and Celine are 4 standard warrior-type humans and a small adventure team. Their teamwork is naturally not a problem. Apart from them, the remaining Loren, Elena, Arashia, and Eleanoa are all genuine magicians. In other words, the numerical aspects are a real headache. After all, this world doesn't have a ranking system, making it hard to quantify strength. In short, Loren's confidence to explore was entirely due to Eleanoa, who was standing beside him yawning. Seats, considering that the tower was hidden in another dimension. With Eleanoa's joking assurance, Loren took a deep breath, and then placed his right hand on the doorknob. Loren suddenly found himself in a room with 3 doors. Loren chose one and opened it, and a dark purple aura rushed out, quickly engulfing him. The sudden sight startled Loren so much that he fell backward. Loren was panting heavily, touching his head with his hand, recalling in horror what had suddenly appeared before his eyes. Loren raised his head and stared solemnly at the tower before him. After placing his hand on the doorknob again, the scene that Loren had seen before did not appear this time. Only after confirming that there were no defensive mechanisms did the group dare to follow Loren inside. As they continued deeper into the corridor, after nodding thoughtfully, Niedinger ended the conversation and continued walking forward with the others. Texas. Loren, who had been hiding behind her, also reluctantly moved to the front. Arashia and Crow were at the back, while Nedinger, Raven, and Eleanoa stood at the very back. Lyriel, Elfrida, Celine, and Violetta were scattered around, scouting the area. Elena, who should have been at the forefront, was startled. Loren felt his body bounce around and finally crash heavily to the ground. The iron's gates are identical in design and shape. The only distinguishable difference is the huge emblem engraved on them. On the left is a huge black dragon head. Loren tried to cast a spell, but found that there was an extremely strong barrier suppressing him. Normally, this obviously dangerous door should have been the first choice to be eliminated. Loren let out a breath and looked up again, somewhat puzzled at the 3 doors in front of him. After pushing open the door, Loren did not see the powerful enemies or terrifying traps he had expected. The room was dark and empty. After a careful inspection, given Loren's limited knowledge of firearms, he could determine that it was a pump-action sniper rifle. The gun was entirely scarlet. Loren only knew that it looked like a standard pump-action sniper rifle. The wall that had blocked them creaked and groaned as it moved to the left and right. The spiral staircase led deep underground. Dispermus prison titine. Besides the Greverous doors through, there were 3 other doors in front of them. The middle door was also open, but behind it was a solid wall. The blonde boy who had come with them was standing in the center of the room. Elena, who was leading the way, ran up to Loren first. Lier curiously peeked out and looked at the red weapon on Loren's shoulder. Asking a question, Eleanoa, standing to the side, looked at the gun with a strange expression, but Loren didn't notice this detail either. Elena quickly stood in front of Loren. Loren was not among these people, because he could understand what they were saying. The language of the Dark Ages was a rather obscure language. As Loren lowered his head to think, the shadow in front of him continued its narration. Together with the original floorboards, the 12 smaller circles formed a larger circle. Within this space, players must assume their assigned role and complete the required tasks. Each of the 12 keys is engraved with a corresponding dark script. To be precise, it was staring at Loren in front of it, with those eyes. As soon as those words were spoken, Violetta added a timely comment from the side, and Elfrena and Serene nodded seriously, indicating that this was the truth. The bird-beak masked girl, whom he hadn't seen before, suddenly appeared next to Loren, startling him. Eleanoa, meanwhile, was intently watching the door on the left. Lily scratched her head, looking somewhat conflicted, while Violetta, standing beside her, chose one of the pillars and jumped up. The oldest person present was in their early 20s, in the prime of their youth, and full of enthusiasm. At least half of them had their eyes shining. Loren slung the gun back over his shoulder and walked toward one of the pillars. Every detail of it was exactly like a dragon. At least the pillar that Loren chose contains a game that can only be played by one person. As Loren pondered, the little dragon in front of him raised its head and uttered a few common words. After the 4th rule was explained, the projection of the key disappeared. Loren then felt his face and body against something cold and realized that he was lying on the ground. Loren used his hands to slowly prop himself up and stand up again. Loren was wearing a cloak that looked like it had been picked up from a trash can. Loren was leaning against the glass he had just used as a mirror. Several men, still sweating profusely and unable to get into the building, were frantically banging on the doors. The wolves weren't attacking the surrounding buildings, but all the doors were securely locked, with iron locks. Stever. After all, everyone knew that the power of the containment object was the most powerful force in this world. Loren found that it lacked a large life force and could not be converted into magic power through breathing techniques. Just then, the girl with the ponytail walked up to Loren again. The room fell silent again. So Loren lowered his head and thought about something, then reached out and grabbed the booklet and opened its pages. 5 o'clock arrived, and the dome in the sky slowly covered the city again like a roof. Loren felt as if he had truly entered into the body of this amnesiac. Among these people was a mysterious figure. Loren had been walking in the city for 3 hours straight. Naturally, they have no time to spend extra curiosity paying attention to others. Loren nodded slightly, then stroked his chin, pondered for a moment, and finally came to an answer. After all, what if this city is different from the nightmare playground in history? After reading carefully for a while, Loren had also organized some necessary information in his mind. The nightmare playground is a kingdom composed of 13 cities. The 13 cities were ruled by 13 city lords. Being prohibited from leaving home at specific times is just one of the rules in each city. Besides that, there are other rules, such as prohibiting doors from opening during certain times. Points or battle merits are simply the currency used in the 13 cities of the nightmare playground. One undoubtedly is through work. Compared to the points earned, the expenses in the city were far greater. After all, it was impossible to survive in this city by sleeping on the streets. At this point, Loren had reached his end. Loren raised his head and looked at the massive mountain range before him. Loren simply shook his head and walked forward. Loren walked toward the wolf's mouth, but soon a small door carved with a huge wolf's head blocked his way. Loren removed the hood from his cloak, raised his head, gazed at the wolf's head before him, and spoke softly. Just then a sound like a computer booting up rang out, and Loren suddenly heard a voice in his mind. Loren scratched his head as he walked forward. Only one door was open. The room was narrow, only big enough for one person. Loren was very familiar with this kind of game. Before transmigrating, Loren had already played werewolf. Loren naturally had no need to worry or be particularly cautious. The wolf's head on the wall turned around once, then uttered 4 words. Loren had done this many times since he transmigrated, and he was quite skilled at it by now. While experiencing sensation, Loren began to reflect on what he had recently been experiencing. After a minute of spinning, one of the 12 cards appeared before Loren's eyes from the disc. 2 large characters were clearly visible on the card. Having completed the basic preparations required of a hunter, Loren felt it was time to begin the game. Loren raised his head and gazed intently at the sky. The sun was high in the sky, warm and scorching, and the heat gave Loren a sense of security. In other words, they only needed to kill the side to win. Loren quickly turned around, took the gun, and pointed it at the source of the sound. Loren stood up and looked at the boy draped in tattered clothes in front of him. Loren held the gun quite nervously. The two were engaged in a bizarre Western duel. Finally, it was the gaunt man in front of them who broke the eerie tranquility. Loren could tell that the opponent was at least at the level of a superhuman warrior. At this level, the opponent was a powerful monster that no amount of mortals could fight against. Even while being chased by a monster far stronger than himself, Loren showed no sign of panic. The enormous monster was covered in thick black fur. While Loren was carefully observing, the rifle, which had already been loaded, was already aimed at the monster's body. The character Loren was controlling simply pulled the trigger without any fluctuation. The roar quickly turned into a scream. Ultimately, it was his first time firing a gun, so Loren wasn't quite skilled enough. In short, although the result was somewhat unsatisfactory, at least the crisis was temporarily averted. Loren turned around skillfully, beckoned to the orange-haired man next to him whose jaw had dropped, and continued running forward. Loren didn't say a word. He just kept walking forward in silence. Daylight arrived, and the werewolf's hunting season was over. Loren slung the gun back over the tattered cloak on his back and continued on his way. Loren blinked in confusion, as if something unpleasant had occurred to him. The door was already quite dilapidated, and even the orange-haired man's thin frame could easily push it open. Inside, someone was already waiting for them. In other words, they are probably similar to the nobles of this wolf city. Further evidence of this is the variety of weapons they wielded. The gaunt man smiled and stepped forward. ignoring the frowning Loren, briefly explained what had happened minutes earlier. Loren felt that an ordinary person would feel profound fear simply from looking at this massive well opening. Upon hearing this, Loren lowered his head and began to ponder. 7 people and 3 wolves are in the middle of it all. In Loren's previous life, werewolf was a standard game of wits. The only person who is not present has been confirmed to be a werewolf. The 12 people present were not superhumans. The 11 players present were discussing the same point. 5 minutes of daylight had passed. Loren was carefully observing the people who were speaking. The burly man who had spoken at the very beginning was now holding a huge shield. Loren stood at the center, guiding the conversation like a leader. Upon hearing this, everyone turned to look at the sky. Except for Loren, everyone instinctively drew their weapons, pointed them at each other, and began a standoff. The standoff was abruptly broken by a strange and violent cough. The one-eyed man suddenly began coughing violently. Loren's body thrashed about like a fish out of water, but it was all a death throes. The surroundings suddenly became quiet. After a long while, the burly man made a declaration in a low voice. The first victim of this game was born on the second night. The witch is a divine role that also exists in the werewolf game in both of Loren's memories. Loren, who was standing to the side, frowned and pondered. Having said all that, the girl's true identity is beyond doubt in everyone's eyes. Loren watched as the Well of Exile opened its enormous maw and completely devoured the 9-fingered, scarred woman. A few minutes later, just as the orange-haired man had moved away from Loren, another figure suddenly approached. The burly man, who had been the leader. Upon hearing this, Loren raised his head and looked up at the sky. Especially now that everyone has gathered together, and there are at least 2 werewolves among them. Some held their shields horizontally in front of them. Loren, who hadn't participated at all, frowned. As Loren turned his gaze to the burly man's brother, at that very moment the sun, which had turned the sky orange, finally began to slowly set. Loren swiftly reached behind his back and grasped the demonic's spear in his hand. Loren had to be extremely careful, especially since the game had progressed for so long. After all, the werewolves had also obtained information about the gun, which was probably why they didn't recklessly attack Loren. Loren's eyes were wide open, and there was a half-claw mark on his neck. Even the massive werewolf was momentarily stunned by the hard gun butt. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Loren leaped backward, successfully escaping the fog that had obscured his vision. Its fur was snow-white, and it exuded a cold aura. Even as the werewolf suddenly began to speak, Loren calmly continued toying with the gun in his hand. The orange-haired man looked up, his eyes filled with greed as he stared at the magic spear in Loren's hand. 3 werewolves walked out carrying heads, one by one. The blonde boy's body was writhing strangely, but the orange-haired youth didn't notice. The orange-haired man seemed to have experienced many things in the past. Loren first felt that he had lost the ability to sense his opponent and his feet. After his body was taken over, Loren breathed a sigh of relief. In other words, it can continue watching without worry until control of its body is regained. By any measure, the game is over. The Snow-White Wolf King felt a little uneasy, so he raised his sword and pointed it at Loren. The boy's eyes remained unchanged, but a hint of sneer could be detected in them. Loren had already discovered this way to win. The massive wolf head was smashed to pieces without a doubt by the sturdy gun butt. Blood splattered, staining the upper half of Loren's head red, but there was no other emotion in his green eyes as, in short, only 2 werewolves remained on the field at that moment. The hunter is about to hunt wolves. Loren's green wolf eyes were fixed on the young man in front of him. Loren didn't know the reason, but all in all, it was great. Loren had witnessed the real power of those bullets. At the same time, the 3rd blood-red bullet was loaded into the chamber. Its body was riddled with holes, and after swaying for a moment, it collapsed to the ground. The bullet was merciless, but the boy who fired it was even more merciless. Loren stared in astonishment at the movements of the movement's ball he had just impersonated. Loren didn't know the identity of the player he was impersonating, but he could only sense an unparalleled power. As a distorted vortex appeared, seemingly sensing something was wrong, Wolfhead's calm voice became tinged with anxiety. After that, Wolfhead was unable to speak anymore. The evidence, perhaps, was the sudden appearance of a massive number of werewolves around them. Loren slowly opened his eyes. Without giving it much thought, Loren simply stepped out and returned to the small room. Loren could vaguely see that the corridor led to several other rooms. The other 4 platforms continued to emit a blue glow, presumably representing those levels that were not yet completed. Celine raised her hand and said seriously, while Violetta sighed and scratched her head as she explained. Not wanting to look at Lyriel's increasingly weak body, Loren turned his head and looked at the other blue platforms. In the other 2 round platforms surrounded by blue light curtains, Niedinger and Raven walked out of the door yawning. Arashia and Elena were leaning against each other. As it continued to eat, the wounds on its body began to disappear at a visible speed. Just looking at it was incredibly painful. As it continued to absorb the energy, under the watchful eyes of others, the blue light barrier surrounding the circular platform finally turned orange, as a small door was carved out of the barrier. Crow was too exhausted to even offer a polite response. 3 days ago, the exploration of the Mage Tower was suddenly turned into a multiplayer game for 12 players. Elena and she were closer. Upon hearing the practical question raised by Loren, after receiving the keys, Tarlingseb appeared beside Loren and began explaining to him the specific spaces the keys represented. Everyone was gathered together, discussing the game. So Loren decided to explore the tower on his own first. Loren guessed that there were even more luxurious private rooms upstairs, which made him even more excited. Besides that, what interested Loren the most was a teleportation room. Several simple teleportation arrays were already set up in the room. Loren turned his head and looked at Tower 7 with some curiosity, asking a question. Upon hearing this, the palm-sized dragon paused for a moment and began to creak and groan. After receiving the last key from Crow, Loren now had a total of 8 keys. Upon entering, Loren was greeted by a massive pool resembling a hot spring. The pool was enclosed by a glass dome. Loren fiddled with the long, slender keys in his hand, took one out, and walked toward a door. Loren recognized it. What he was looking at was a large factory, specifically used to produce golems. In addition, there was a small warehouse next to it. Loren went to take a look and found that it contained a large number of completed parts. Puppetry is a major branch of magical engineering, which also involves the other 4 major schools. In the past year, Loren has studied puppetry in depth. Loren then recalled the war puppet that Elena had lent him 2 years ago. Due to a series of events, it was never returned and was still near Ouroboros, actually belonging to Loren. Loren prepared to carefully plan these business strategies. Good girl Arashia laughed heartily, as if she had just pulled off her first prank. Eleanor was stunned for 3 seconds before belatedly realizing what was happening. Loren sighed, turned, and walked forward. Loren took out the 3rd key and opened the door. Eleanor and Loren gave their answers simultaneously, while the latter walked forward, curiously waving her key and asking a question. Inside were many huge bookshelves filled with all sorts of books. For some reason, Arashia suddenly turned her head away shyly and changed the subject. After hearing this, Loren thought for a moment and then gave his reply. After skillfully opening the door, Loren was hit by a blast of cold air. The evidence was that there were still many unmelted ice blocks around. With just a gentle pull, the cabinet door fell down. The stench killed their desire to explore any further, and they turned and ran away in a flash. In Maxix, a world largely devoid of the internet, calculating dates and times is a cumbersome affair. While magic is undeniably convenient, Loren ultimately felt that some scientific tools were still necessary to aid in daily life. Loren had a subarray of a teleportation magic circle hidden in his clothes. Loren was making final preparations next to the storm. Loren turned his head and saw the island's Grand Elder transporting a huge box to him. Saputa is an island rich in minerals, possessing not only a large variety of magical ores, but also gold mines. Loren shook his head with some regret, then continued his brief discussion with the Grand Elder. A large mountain, completely devoid of human habitation, suddenly began to tremble violently. Loren leaned against the bows, enjoying the sea breeze, while chatting with Claude, who was steering the ship. Elena was busy running around, and Arashia had just stepped out of the door onto the deck, seemingly having opened everyone's mouths. The people listening to the speech also almost fell over, due to the ship's rocking. Loren gritted his teeth, while Crow hugged the cannon and began to charge it continuously. A crisp sound of shattering glass rang out in an instant, and the circular walls were quickly shattered. Eleanor raised her head and looked seriously at the dissipating dark clouds and the scattered shadow of the black dragon. Loren also raised his head, looking somewhat nervously at the location of the black dragon. The reunion with the black dragon at sea was probably the last little hurdle in Loren's adventure. After that, The journey back to the city was smooth sailing. Since finishing up the matter in Obristo, Loren has devoted most of his time to his own territory. A ship even larger than the Storm was moored at the port. A large number of crates were piled up on the shore where the ship was docked. Several men in uniforms were working hard to move them, constantly loading and unloading them onto the ship. Gerald turned around, walked up to Loren, and bowed respectfully to him. Loren carefully looked around, while Gerald slowly explained their actions. The great river that appeared a year ago was the best sea transport channel. New potential was constantly emerging. Loren felt that as long as there was a solid foundation to realize this potential. As Loren habitually contemplated the possibilities of the future, he began to organize the things he needed to do. Several maids were bustling around the room, carrying bags that looked like fuel. The fireplace was already roaring. Even though it was only September, the maids had even taken out their warm gloves. After the door was pushed open, Loren was able to see what was inside. Vesta was engrossed in reading a book. Latel raised her head slightly, then continued to fiddling with what she was holding. Seemingly spurred on by Loren's comprehension, Vesta sighed, put down his book, and began to explain. Latel put down what she was holding, picked up her tea, took a sip, and continued the conversation. Loren was too busy to reply. He was focusing all his energy on researching the phone from the other world. Latel nodded readily, and then responded. Loren sat down, took a quick breath, and then began searching for the information he needed. During his trip to Sepota, Loren discovered many strange and suspicious points. First, there's the Mage Tower, and then, there are the 13 games they need to complete. After piecing together these keywords, Loren began searching for relevant information without stopping. Loren found the corresponding page. Loren took a deep breath and began to read. The Immortal King's Mount is a true, pure-blooded black dragon. Dragons are greedy, lazy, and incredibly arrogant creatures. Such beings can be defeated, killed, or even bribed, but they will never submit, especially to humans of lower bloodlines. Dragons are the noblest bloodline, but there are also distinctions of rank and status among dragons. Every single one of these abilities is unlike that of a black dragon. He made with a black ponytail opened the door and gestured to Loren that it was time for dinner. On it were already laid out various exquisitely presented dishes, like works of art. The aroma of the dishes, a blend of different precious spices and well-prepared ingredients, was incredibly enticing. While this savage way of eating was enjoyable at first, it became tiresome after a while. As Loren was guessing this, the maids brought out the last dish. The slightly strange tranquility was broken only by the sudden, loud roar outside. Loren curiously peeked out the window and looked directly down at the city's central square. Loren gave an awkward laugh, then lowered his body slightly, and began to focus on eating. Latel, while putting a crab claw into her mouth, nodded seriously, and continued the conversation. Vesta nodded, a rare occurrence for Loren. Loren knew this was a rare compliment for someone like him. Latel smiled and clapped her hands. Only after he had almost recovered did Loren hear the anxious voices of Sims coming from outside. Loren took a breath, then looked up seriously at the two people sitting opposite him. Latel and Vesta seemed a bit hesitant after dinner, as if they had a lot to say. Loren could only laugh it off, and then turned and left. Latel hugged her raised leg and couldn't help but sigh. The carriage continued to move slowly forward. The Mage Tower in Sepota is very likely a legacy from the Dark Ages. Originally, there were two towers, one standing in another dimension, and the other standing on the real Earth. The two towers were connected and echoed each other. For Loren, the real business of the night was about to begin. After walking with Eleanor inside the mountain for a while, they soon arrived at a small door. Loren took a shallow breath. Loren had always been curious about the enigmatic girl in front of him. Eleanor couldn't help but sigh softly, and then began to tell her story. After saying this, Loren raised his head, nodded firmly, and gave his answer. Once the dust settled, Loren realized it was a rather familiar, thick book. Loren said it was familiar because it was the book he had brought with him. Sitting across from Loren, Eleanor stroked the book cover and whispered something, as if he had just remembered it. After all, the so-called officially recognized adventurers are essentially jobs specifically designed for extraordinary individuals. The Adventurers Guild is an organization formed through cooperation between two countries, governing individuals with extraordinary abilities. For lords, having a large number of powerful extraordinary individuals stationed in their cities is naturally very beneficial. Eleanor's hands were on a crystal ball. Sensing his tension, the silver-haired girl stood beside him and gently comforted Loren. Loren kept his hand on the crystal ball. Eleanor put away the crystal ball, and then began to put away everything she had just taken out. As Eleanor explained, he took out all sorts of things. The Adventurers Guild officially opened its doors around 8 a.m. As soon as the doors opened, they rushed in and quickly selected high-value missions. With a bang, they pushed open the door and fell miserably to the ground. Each of the 4 men carried a backpack and held their own weapon, clearly ready for battle. The surrounding air was quite warm. Furthermore, the current Agate agency is theoretically exclusively for adventurers with officials hired by Loren. The good news is that, although they arrived 4 hours late due to waking up late, after all, the number of fried rice cooks in this city is currently limited. After browsing through the resource protection and city defense missions, the girls finally chose one of them. Lily took it and quickly opened it. The recent sudden and massive cold wave has caused fuel demand to surge several times over. Mining began slowly more than half a year ago. Violetta then rubbed her hands together and gave an awkward smile. After Crow left, the 4 of them didn't act. The reason it's classified as an AE level mission is probably because there's so much to handle. To complete all the tasks, the others also took up their weapons and prepared to begin today's adventure. Coal mines, iron mine, copper mines centered around this long canyon. The group quickly discovered many rich mineral veins. First, had lumberjacks dig up a large amount of timber from the Black Forest. Upon closer inspection, they were even thick cashmere jackets. Before the other 3 could speak, Elfrana, holding a rapier, raised an eyebrow and quickly took over the conversation. Just then, Lyriel wiped the sickle with her hand and smiled brightly. The inside of the mine tunnel was quite cool. The only things used for lighting and heating were the oil candles that the miners had placed nearby. The crisp sound was the only sound in the cave, as a strange creaking sound rang out. Sometime later, 2 single-handed sickles formed a square yoke and silently fell from the sky. The swarm of insects began to riot in an instant. The managers who had led the girls into the mine through the side path. Lily curiously crouched down and began to carefully observe these creatures called gold-eating bugs. The shell is shiny, as if it has been specially coated with oil, like the brilliance of diamonds and crystals. Violetta used tweezers to remove an insect, held it in the air, shook it gently, and then squeezed it hard. Violetta had prepared the spottle spots in advance and deliberately placed them under the insects to collect the strange oil. Some of them emitted a dazzling light, some had strange shapes, and some looked very ordinary. After a few minutes, the orange-red liquid had solidified. Upon seeing this action, the manager next to him was startled and hurriedly ran to Lyriel's side, anxiously saying, Lyriel smiled, then put away the scythe in her hand, and nodded in satisfaction. Their hard shells were easily softened and burned away. The magic crystals in the weapons were refilled, and everyone's eyes darted around, searching for any that had escaped. The cleanup was progressing quickly, and the flames were dissipating just as fast. The gold-devouring beetles were quickly eliminated, but not all of them were killed. Just then Lyriel, carrying a scythe, suddenly appeared out of nowhere and stood before everyone. To the surprise of the 3 girls, there was no loud crashing sound when their fists touched the rock wall. The 3 girls quickly blocked the doorway, curiously peering into the empty space inside. Lyriel picked up the torch beside her, stepped into the secret passage, and smiled at the ashen-faced administrator. After searching around the secret passage, Lyriel quickly found a piece of coal. After searching for a while, the group quickly found a carriage with a sign on it. Inside the carriage was a clever-looking man who had been lying on a foal. Upon hearing this, the 4 men nodded helplessly. Wall coughed lightly, then began to explain. 4 burly men, who looked very strong, rode on fine horses and held weapons, guarding the caravan from all sides. 4 carriages and 4 riders surrounded the 2 carriages from all 8 directions. When they encountered trouble, the 3 habitually looked to Lyriel, who was their leader. In short, the girls quickly completed their preparations in order to capture the bandits. The 3 people who couldn't be seen inside the carriage quickly took out their weapons in the cramped space. In the next instant, the girl's body transformed into a crimson mist, rushing forward like the wind. Lyriel's body swayed and she fell off the horse. In short, what followed was a massacre. Some of the foals broke free from their restraints and ran around in panic. The 8 people standing there were nervously staring at each other. Crow was really busy today. By morning, Crow had already completed a considerable amount of work. Arashia hurriedly put on her coat and explained as she walked towards the door. As a result, this horrific car accident has not been discovered to this day. The avenue, less than 6 months old, was thus subjected to its first act of deliberate damage. Faced with the golden wall, the girls quickly moved aside, making room for the white-haired girl to launch an attack. Lyriel and Elfrena stood around her, gripping their scythes and rapiers, watching their surroundings nervously. The 8 men gripped their weapons tightly, their expressions growing to increasingly serious. For some reason, the group felt their legs trembling. Eleanor turned the pages of the Book of Abaran, tapping them lightly with her fingers, and then spoke. Loren looked even more confused, but he didn't interrupt and continued to listen. Eleanor's explanation didn't stop. She continued to describe in detail what Loren was going to do. After hearing the 3 names, Eleanor thought about it carefully for a moment, and then nodded. Loren nodded, tidying up his surroundings, but then suddenly turned around and asked, as if he had thought of something. Crow, the only one holding an umbrella, was standing nearby, watching the others' strange actions with some concern. For some reason, Crow was trying to change the subject. Crow turned his head frantically and said something rather strange. Serene and Elfrena stood silently outside the door, earnestly patting the door with feather dusters. Several maids stood nearby, deliberately leaning against the wall, watching the spectacle like spectators, even though it was their job. Lorenz decided to go and ask the person directly what had happened. The 3 people who were kneeling respectfully on the ground raised their heads in hope when they heard Loren's voice. Arashia coughed lightly, then began to explain in detail what had happened. She nodded helplessly, then turned to Loren, as if she had suddenly thought of something crucial. Upon hearing this, Loren frowned, a rare occurrence for him today. Upon hearing this, Arashia understood what the other person was thinking. As someone who loves to eat, Loren always looked forward to mealtimes when guests came to set out Ouroboros. Arashia had specifically told Loren about this beforehand. Loren clapped his hands and smiled as he spoke. Elfrena held her chopsticks very politely, taking small bites and maintaining impeccable manners. Has it changed a lot compared to before? Loren didn't quite understand what kind of person Arashia had been. Loren's life before graduating from Unosi Academy was merely his own memory. Rubbing his head, Loren decided to give up thinking about these annoying things. In short, it is called the Silverflow Mansion. The first floor is a shopping mall where everyone can come in to view and purchase goods. Elena smiled gently, then took the initiative to ask. Arashia shook her head, but instead of giving the real reason, she changed the subject. Moreover, for Arashia now, this kind of thing is not important. Elena reached out and pushed a bunch of keys in front of Arashia. Loren began to chew the food with satisfaction. Wall, Bugalita and Varen all stared wide-eyed as if they hadn't expected it at all. Nat, on the other hand, seemed to have expected it. She secretly went behind Loren, quietly took out a cream puff from the bag, and put it in her mouth. Loren crossed his legs, looked up at the sky, and said somewhat bewilderedly, while chewing. He sat down, looked at Loren's face, and smiled as he spoke. The next morning, Loren began showing his friends, who were staying at the hotel, around the city. The 2 men stood on opposite sides of the garden. Varen stood curiously beside them. Loren quietly slipped a chair underneath him, squinting as he looked out over the garden. Running up to Loren, Lyriel raised her hand and asked him with some confusion. Crow also wanted to dodge these attacks, but his movement speed was inferior to the speed of the attacks. The white-haired, white-bearded old man continued speaking, only as the young man's body launched forward. Lying on the ground, Crow looked shocked. As Loren led the group away from the garden and towards the castle gates, he nodded indifferently, acknowledging his words. Before leaving, Wall carefully examined the castle, then turned around, coughed lightly, and walked over to Loren, speaking to him. Loren raised his head somewhat helplessly, let out a sigh, and then nodded in reply. To Loren's surprise, after he said those words, Wall, Bujalita, and Varen all nodded in unison. Nat hesitated for a moment, glanced at Wall's expression, and then nodded seriously. The former looked directly at Loren and spoke in a serious tone. For some reason, Loren chose to avoid the topic and continued leading everyone toward the door. Starting at the Adventurers Guild in the city center, Loren then led the group on a stroll through the city. After thinking it over, Loren decided to use the exclusive system from the Maxix Empire that he had previously acquired. After seeing this scene, Loren finally understood why the other party had disappeared for so long. Turning his head, Arashia saw everyone present. Loren smiled, and then waved to greet them. Loren turned to look at Wall with curiosity. Loren then turned to look at Elena, as someone who had personally experienced this event. Arashia shut up, halfway through her sentence, realizing she'd made a fool of himself. For some reason upon seeing this action, Loren suddenly began to tremble all over. Elena suddenly revealed a cunning smile like a fox. She turned to look at Arashia, who was still struggling with the bread, and suddenly revealed a sly smile. The girl was standing on a sickle stuck in the mast, painting it with white paint. The other 3 girls had gotten paint from somewhere and were applying it. The girl who was painting heard the voices of the group and turned around, excitedly shouting. Time flew by, and before they knew it, it was evening. After touring the not-so-large Ouroboros, the group returned to the castle to rest. Loren looked down at it, his eyes widening instantly like bells, and he shouted in a somewhat out of control. Varen rolled the scroll back up, sat on the floor, coughed lightly, and began to explain. Loren took out the large bag of cream puffs from the cabinet next to him. Seemingly recalling some unpleasant memory, Varen lowered his head, looked at his mechanical right hand, and said with some helplessness. Loren left his room because he needed to see Belle about something. Loren took a few steps forward and headed towards the garden behind the castle. The giant wolf is now lying on the ground. Some time later, Crow had already tossed aside the purple lightning spear in his hand and grabbed a wooden sword instead. Crow's body was covered in wounds and he was swaying. The wounds were not the kind of cuts that would appear on a battlefield. In contrast to Klaus, Gerald's much larger body had far fewer wounds, which was within Loren's expectations. After all, there was a considerable difference in strength between the two. Loren, who was watching from the side, frowned in dissatisfaction. Loren swung his wooden sword at close range, making short thrusting motions, and charged towards Gerald. When his first attack failed, Crow withdrew his wooden sword and thrust forward again with lightning's tracing speed. Crow let out a long sigh, nodded with difficulty, and got up from the grass. Loren and the gun was also his strongest weapon. Loren suddenly remembered his teacher, who was skilled in using a bow and arrow. Having overheard an interesting topic, Loren nodded seriously. Elena took a can out of her pocket and gently broke it open. Loren, who had been waiting nearby, quickly went to her side. Arashia had opened the window. Loren took a deep breath, then awkwardly walked over and called out. Elena, who had secretly followed, stared blankly at what was happening before her eyes. When Loren returned to the middle of the mountains, he saw Eleanor intently playing with a mirror in his hand. Loren looked at it curiously and asked a question. Eleanor watched Loren, who was in the mirror space, with great curiosity, while also explaining the specifics of the situation. Loren didn't know if this was simply the other party using the contained object in a better way. The young man was wearing the exact same clothes as himself and had the same face. To be precise, all the asymmetrical parts were reversed. Before Loren could even process what was happening, his opponent had already indifferently reached out a hand. Green lightning bolts descended from nowhere, striking the spot where Loren had been a second earlier. Eleanor, who was standing next to him, chuckled as she flipped through the book in her hand. Both fought in the same way, but the Loren in the mirror seemed to be more skilled, or perhaps luckier. Taking the lead in launching an attack, the Loren in the mirror gradually gained control of the battlefield. Loren's left-hand swordsmanship might still be able to maintain a 50-50 chance. Finally, as his opponent seized an opening, the Loren in the mirror attacked forward. While taking notes, Eleanor explained the next goal to Loren, who had just come out of the mirror space. Loren stared his hands, trembling as if he were looking directly at the devil. The clay golem outside continued working, as if the conversation between the two was nothing more than a trivial matter. After hesitating for a moment, the 3 girls below nodded helplessly, while Lyriel smiled happily and continued with her plan. A huge sailing ship did indeed sail out of the ship's door, but it was not Loren's ship. Crow turned around in a panic and saw 4 girls with dusty faces behind him. The scabbard and hilt were painted pure black, with a white hilt and guard. Gerald took the knife and its holder and placed them in front of Crow. Upon hearing this, Crow was not afraid as he had expected. Crow took a deep breath and then pulled the blade out in one swift motion. Drawing a sword from its sheath was like pushing open the gates of a cemetery filled with the unjustly killed. Coming to his senses, Crow found himself kneeling on the cabin floor. Loren held the black longsword in his hand. Loren, having returned to normal, chuckled softly, stood up, and looked at Crow. earnestly confirming the news. Crow nodded first, then shook his head, and said in a low voice with some regret. The quill pen slowly flew up, dipped itself in ink, and began to write on the paper. A large number of documents were laid out on the table next to them. Just then, Arashia walked out of the door, and upon hearing this, she couldn't help but chuckle softly. Loren felt that her mood had been good ever since he gave her a piece of cake yesterday. Nat and Varen also came in. They were carrying things and seemed to be helping to pack. The red-haired girl had been speaking in a weak and listless manner all day. Knowing that the other party was probably angry for some unknown reason after what happened with Arashia, Loren smiled, waved to express his gratitude, put his hand on his waist, said goodbye, and left. Eleanor had already placed various items beside the furnace. Loren took one last look at the demon sword at his waist. Loren took a deep breath, reviewed the relevant forging knowledge in his mind, and blinked. Eleanor, who was standing next to him, lifted the bag with a little curiosity. Loren took out the ore needed to forge a sword. Inside the glass jar was a bright little fireball as bright and hot as a small sun. A large amount of fuel had already been filled inside. As Loren watched the fire spread rapidly, he began to explain in detail. Compared to ordinary forging, the extraordinary level of forging had undergone a complete upgrade. The metal, the flames, the furnace, the anvil, everything the blacksmith used had been upgraded in the hands of the forger. To conquer these, naturally, even more advanced forging techniques were required. Upon hearing this, Loren paused in confusion for a moment, then instinctively stopped what he was doing. Unexpectedly, Eleanor simply replied with that sentence, then suddenly shut his mouth and continued to swing his blade. In any case, as the white ore turned red, the first step of forging, heating, was completed. In contrast, the characteristic of the superhumans in the Maxix Empire is to mobilize their life force. Eleanor had stopped swinging her sword. With the hammer falling, the forging of the knife officially began. All things have some degree of toxicity, let alone cigarettes used purely for relaxation. With some doubt, Vera took the letter. Vera was even more confused. Vera gently sat down next to the little girl, who politely smiled and then began to complain. After a pause, Monica Sariva finally broke into a wide, joyful smile. Normally, if Loren wanted to, this task could be completed in just one day. Several friends who had known each other for several years were arguing fiercely over a name. Loren noticed that Varen and Val were looking at the weapons with envious eyes. As a result, everyone instinctively showed their contemptuous eyes and made cold comments to the short young man. A tall woman with black hair in a single ponytail moved through the not-so-large room. Upon seeing Loren enter, Bell continued working, maintaining his usual nimble movements, while asking a question. Loren belatedly lowered his head and looked at the maid, who was the same age as his sister. Loren suddenly realized that ever since he came to this territory, with the boys' joyful shouts, this long-awaited tour, which may change the world in the future, is about to begin. After getting off the train with a heater, the young people took off their thick clothes to keep warm. After agreeing on the specific time to meet, everyone began discussing what they should do next. The red-haired girl stared lifelessly at Loren with her beautiful eyes. Vamona's estate was still exactly as Loren remembered it. Loren heard that this current ducal mansion was extensively renovated by his father 25 years ago. Loren initially wanted to say something when he saw it, but he quickly realized it wasn't that simple. Loren glanced at the cloak and suddenly realized. The maid with bright red hair bowed respectfully to Loren, then turned to the man in the black coat. Raya clapped her hands lightly, and several maids, whom Loren had never seen before, came out. Raya herself led the three of them around the manor, while explaining the current situation of Vimona's manor. Raya nodded knowingly, then bowed slightly and pointed to the other end of the corridor. Eleanor, who was standing nearby, was already surrounded by other maids, who seemed to have prepared a room for him. After greeting Loren, Eleanor turned and followed the maids. Lotel was standing in a corridor. Lotel sighed and then began to explain. Upon hearing that it was a serious matter, Lotel also became serious. Loren finally understood what his sister meant. Upon hearing this, Loren blinked, lowered his head, pinched his chin, and thought about it seriously. Loren originally only wanted to hire someone temporarily to help manage things while he was away as a temporary worker. Gloria was just like the academic scholars Loren had in mind. Even though Loren had raised it again, Loren looked helpless as he began packing his things. Lotel sat beside him, legs crossed, and said with some curiosity. Loren wanted to continue, But he suddenly realized that, excluding his cronies, the only man around him was Crow. By this time, Loren had already packed his suitcase. Soren was curious about the contents of the box, but it was, after all, the other person's secret. Belle and Eleanor walked up to them with their luggage. Loren was a little scared. Upon hearing Loren's words, an awkward smile appeared on Wall's delicate, almost feminine face. Loren clapped his hands lightly and changed the subject. When he arrived here, Loren felt as if he had returned to his previous life's academy days. The stadium was already packed with people. In short, the number of people was much larger than Loren had expected. Upon hearing this, Loren sat in the carriage that had arrived and began to think seriously, rubbing his chin. After answering his own question, Varen began adjusting his mechanical right hand, no longer bothering Loren. Not long after, 5 minutes later, Wall and Bugalita returned. Upon hearing the not-so-familiar name, Loren frowned somewhat strangely. Loren had previously thought that the decline of the Goulian family was simply due to some unforeseen reason. Lawrence decided to wait until he met his sister again to hear her detailed explanation. Everyone looked up in confusion, watching as the several huge oval shadows slowly descended from the sky to the ground. Loren looked up in surprise at the huge oval balloon high in the sky. Its true identity was a warship that was much larger than the storm. As several airships rumbled and landed on the ground, this seemingly easy journey was about to begin. Lyriel also gave up decorating the game and joined her friends in sticking the stickers on the window. To avoid being humiliated in aerial combat, Loren had specifically trained in flying skills long ago. Most people are observing the vast sky that the airship reaches, but Loren is observing the airships itself. Nevertheless, it was still much faster than traveling by sea, by boat. Only now that this advantage has been leveled, can they finally seriously join hands to benefit the residents. Turning around, Eleanor, draped in a cloak, had somehow appeared beside Loren. Loren wasn't quite sure why the other person had brought this up. As if he had personally deduced the truth in a complex murder case, Loren excitedly revealed the results. Loren was holding a bunch of things that looked like keys. Loren took one of them and found that it was a key card for a room. The 4 girls who had been watching the clouds quickly tidied up the toys on the table. Val kept his gaze on the cloaked girl until she left with Lyriel and the others. Wall frowned slightly before speaking. Loren frowned slightly, and his mind involuntarily recalled a conversation the two of them had a year ago. The girl with long sky-blue hair was leaning down slightly. The two of them were talking to each other, but it was unclear what they were talking about. The boy turned around and looked at Loren with a strange gaze that was 3 parts wary. Arashia stood behind him and slowly began to explain after the bow was completed. Ian Ikra, who had left Arashia's side at some point, quietly ran back. Arashia lowered her head somewhat shyly, stretched out her right hand, and made a few anxious beeping motions.